What's up, everyone? You are listening to the latest Flyers Talk podcast. Brooke Dester here, and I am joined by Joe Fordyce. And Joe, it's been a very long season, but we finally made it to the home stretch. Flyers have 6 games left this year, and while we want to talk about this last very important pivotal stretch for this team to make a playoff push, there's one more important thing we got to talk right now. It's John Tortorella in the headlines again, very up and down week, pretty much basically since the end of the trade deadline. His name's been in and out of headlines left and right. So let's jump right into it and talk about Torts. And what's your initial opinion from this crazy week that we've had with him?
I think yesterday that line of questioning that came up at his press conference about do you worry that there's a point where some of the players kind of get, I guess, like sick of, like, it's almost like maybe will they get Torts fatigue in the sense that he got thrown out of a game, the Cutter Gauthier stuff, which, nobody really confirmed it was about Torts, but there was a lot of noise about Torts with that situation. And then, the daily meetings with the media, the stuff with Felix Sandstrom a week and a half ago. It's
the suspension.
There's always
there's so much
there's
going on.
always something. And if there's not something, then he provides something. And then he provided something Monday night by calling the team soft and calling everyone out. And then I think some people expected him to walk that back yesterday. I did not expect him to walk it back, and he didn't. But then him going on and on about if that he's here to push the players, and if they don't want to be pushed, they have the wrong guy here.
Sure.
That's when things start to. Anyone listening to that could start to wonder, what is the goal of this messaging? Is it to galvanize the team? He didn't name any players by name Monday night. I think if you look at the game, you can figure it out.
Sure.
And Morgan Frost has been kind of one of his targets, and Morgan Frost gave you the frustrations that Torts has had with him within about 5 minutes of real time the other night.
Yeah.
Scoring and then turning the puck over in front of his own net when there was really no reason to come out in front of your own net with the puck in overtime.
Yeah, it's you're kind of screwed either way, because he, kind of cost them 2 points, but you're looking at the last stretch of games across the East this week. That 1 point that the Flyers got because of Frost was so vital right now when you look at the standings.
Yeah, it's the only reason they're ahead of the Islanders.
Right.
And we knew that Islanders game was a huge swing game, and to get one out of it is a huge deal. The problem is when you take it and you put it together with the Montreal loss and the Chicago loss.
Yeah.
And then, you look at what's ahead. The games that are giving them problems are not games that should be giving them problems. Let's say they are not. They kind of show up. I mean, or don't show up for games like Chicago.
They play to their opponent's level.
Yeah,
and I think that's their biggest kryptonite this whole season, really.
Yeah, and I don't think they played, and the coach didn't think they played bad against Montreal. That was quite different than Chicago. And then, obviously, the second period against the Islanders got him the other night.
Yeah, I remember funny enough, I'm over at the ballpark for Phillies, and I have Flyers up on my laptop, and I'm paying attention, and I'm just seeing on Twitter that everyone was like, oh my God, Torts just absolutely ripped one post game following that game. And I'm listening and I'm like, oh my God, like this is, it's like, I don't want to say it's an all timer from Tortorella, because I feel like, again, we're getting these kind of quotes bi-weekly at this point. But, if there's one thing that about Tortorella, and he has been exactly the same person from the minute he came into this city, this job, and he's not going to change. He is going to keep his his methods, the Torts way. And the thing that, it's kind of crazy is that when it's working, people are like, trust in Tortorella. He knows what he's doing. He's lighting a fire under this team. But the few times where it's fallen short, people are like, oh, this is why he's not a match for Philly. It's one way or the other. You gotta give him a chance. He's displayed time and time again who he is as a coach. I still personally sit here and think that he is the right person at this time for this club. Moving forward, who knows? He even said at the beginning of the season, when this team is ready to win, what do you expect? And he came right out of the gates. He was like, I don't know if I'll be the coach at that point.
Mm-hmm.
He knows that he needs to be the coach for this team right now. And he's doing everything that he can to really ensure a playoff push.
You have a contingent of fans, like old school fans, that love when players get yelled at.
Mm-hmm.
They love when coaches come out, and it doesn't matter what the sport is, but when a coach comes out and torches players by name or as a whole, like Torts did the other night, there is a contingent of fans that love that. But then there are the other fans that are always skeptical of when the shelf life of John Tortorella is going to wear out, because it's worn out in every other place that he's been.
Yeah.
It hasn't worn out. Like if we're talking about now being that time, that would be quicker than anywhere else. So I don't think now is that time. But in this situation, you do have the uniqueness of, this is not the coach that was picked by the president and GM of this team currently. And what I will say about what he said the other night is, I think there's buzzwords in sports that are risky to use, and soft is one of them.
Yeah.
That gets everyone's attention. You've had teams, and I'm not referring to just hockey, but I'm referring to all sports. You have teams that seemingly quit when they hear that word.
Yep.
They quit on a coach. I don't think John Tortorella is one of those coaches that players are going to quit on, having talked to and working with Scott, who played with him.
Sure.
Or, played for him. So I don't think that that's going to happen here, but I think it is risky to use words like that. And maybe that's what he did. Maybe he was taking a risk, because he knows a risk is, you need to take a risk to get this team in the playoffs.
Absolutely.
In the rut
he's
they're
taken
in.
risks left and right
Mm-hmm.
all season. And the biggest takeaway from everything is that they are here. And he said it himself. He's like, we're here. A lot of that, whether or not you want to give credit to Tortorella, he's a big part of that. And you really just have to remember that going forward and through this stretch. Now, if for some reason, and we'll discuss this later in the pod, but if things kind of dissipate and, fall off, and we don't see playoffs after talking playoffs basically since January, maybe it's a different conversation in the off season. But right now, it's not really one to be had. And I guess we'll see where things go, but it'll be an interesting couple weeks coming up.
Yeah, and I do think that there's an interesting change in the messaging over the last 2 weeks, in the sense that whenever John Tortorella got asked, or the conversation went in the playoff direction up until probably 10 days ago, he was like, well, we're not talking playoffs. We're just taking one game at a time. And then last week, all of a sudden is, I'm talking about playoffs now because we're here. And then the other day when it was, we're here now. And that's basically all that matters, when really development and guys learning and weeding out the guys that are going to be here, and the guys, that was the dominant portion of conversations up until that point. And now it's, who are the best guys to win on that night, because we need points for the playoff push. And that's being talked about.
Yeah.
And while it was the case earlier in the season, it wasn't being talked about. It was like, we're not talking about that all the time.
We're still focusing on the rebuild.
Yeah.
We want to win now, but we're focusing on the rebuild. And now it's like, we got to put the best guys out there. We got to win. It's very important. Playoffs are coming up. But I mean, think about it. If he wasn't concerned about the playoffs, again, that's another kind of, you're damned if you do, you damned if you don't talk about it. Where if they're like, yeah, we're focusing on right now. I don't care about the playoffs. I'm just focusing on the game in front of us. People will be like, you've held a playoff spot since basically early January. And, we're a handful of games out of the season, and now you're not going to talk about the playoffs. So it's obviously an important conversation because it's what everybody is talking about right now. Fans, players, front office. It's wrapping up the year and looking ahead to see what's coming next. And right now it's late April, May hockey, hopefully.
Well, I do think that there is, back when the Flyers hired John Tortorella, obviously it was different people in charge.
Mhm.
But I remember thinking it's kind of an odd hire for a team that is so drastically going in the rebuild direction.
Sure.
Because he's not a guy, he's going to do what he said yesterday. He's going to push players. He's going to get more out of them than the roster on paper. He's going to get more out of the roster than, what's on paper. He did it in Columbus. I mean, his roster at the Rangers, decent, it's
Sure.
different situation there. Same thing with Vancouver. And then, of course, the Cup team that he won with in Tampa had a lot of really good players on it. But you're never going to see a John Tortorella team just lay down and lose games. And, they knocked off the President's Trophy winner when he was in Columbus, and Tampa had the best record. They knocked them off in the first round, and then that team went on to win back-to-back cups. So it's the messaging didn't really match with the hire. And then when Danny and Jonesy took over, everyone seemed to be in lockstep with the rebuild's the most important thing. The rebuild's the most important thing. Even this season, when they're in a playoff spot, it's like, yeah, it's nice, but you kind of got this feeling they're playing with house money.
Sure.
And then last week, that seemed to go in the other direction slowly, but definitely surely.
Yeah.
In the other direction about the playoffs. So I do find that interesting. But, I mean, it's not like you can sit here and say, let's just ignore this huge elephant in the room.
Right.
Because you're here. There's 6 games left, and they're in a playoff spot, and there's teams closing in on them. So you have to talk about it.
Yeah. Celebrity cook Steve Martirano brings his Italian-American cooking back to home Philly. Enjoy Martirano's Prime at Rivers Casino and Steve's famous meatballs with Sunday gravy, prime steaks, and more. Make reservations for Martirano's Prime on Open Table. Now, Joe, you were just talking about this last stretch of 6 games, and clearly they're games that they really have to win out. And you're looking at the rest of the standings in the East and how tightly knit this race is going to be. And I've been saying it for weeks now, but I really do think it's going to come down to this last game at the Wells Fargo Center, Flyers hosting Capitals. And it might be like a 2010 situation with the Rangers where whoever wins is going to the playoffs and whoever loses is getting set packing for the off season. So let's kind of break down this last stretch of 6 games. What do you want to see out of this team aside from a win, obviously, to just what they need to do to kind of build themselves up to move into the postseason, hopefully.
Well, you have 4 road games in a row, and that is, I understand they're not playing the greatest of competition, but the games against not the greatest of competition are the ones that are giving them the most difficulty right now. And then you have head-to-head games that are big deals. The Devils, I think, particularly after their loss last night, I mean, they're not.
Yeah.
But it's not. The Devils have talent to make that game hard. Like, I don't think you're just going to show up and blow out the Devils. It's not going to happen because of the talent they have. And really, any of these teams, there's another game in Montreal. Always a tough place to play. You only have 2 home games left. One of them is that game against Washington. And, I think the amount of pressure on the Flyers is starting to be felt by these young players.
Yeah, well, they came into this season with 0 expectations and really no pressure. It was all right, we're going to see what's going to happen. They were projected very much so league-wide to be a bottom 10 team this year. So it's one of those situations where it's like now where people are paying attention to them. They do expect them to make the playoffs, and they have this pressure. It's an experience that, like you said, a lot of these younger players have never had before. So how do they adapt to this? How do they, kind of just fight through? and make things happen. And as of right now, via Money Puck from this morning, as of Thursday morning, Flyers have 62.2% chance of making the postseason. Washington is down to 54.6. Detroit's at 42.2, and then you kind of still have the Islanders lingering at 25%, and Pittsburgh's really significantly dropped off at 14.7. Though a nice scoreboard watch you'll have to do tonight is Capitals Penguins, where you don't want the Penguins to grab any points, but you just hope it leaves with one team takes two. You don't want you don't need any overtime situations. You kind of hope that Pittsburgh wins tonight and then kind of falls off. And same situation for the Caps, who have 2 games at hand on the Flyers. They still have 8 games left to go. And
I don't understand why their percentages are low.
Yeah.
Other than, I mean, that how they come up with that number.
Yeah.
I don't think it takes into account how they've been playing. But that can be the only explanation, how they get blown out by Buffalo the other night, like in a game that they needed to have. But to me, wait, no, the Islanders won. The Islanders have the low percentage. That's the one I don't understand, because they're in the 20s.
And they
have games in hand.
They do.
And they've been playing pretty well. And Patrick Waugh. I mean,
you never count out Patrick Waugh.
No.
You never do.
Yeah. And really, they have, of all these teams, outside of a few guys on the Capitals, they have the most experience.
Yeah.
Those guys have played in conference finals. They've been in a ton of playoff games. Brock Nelson, Anders Lee, Barzal, all those guys have played a lot of playoffs. So to me, that's the team that worries me the most. Team with games in hand. They've gotten themselves back in it. They just won a 4-point swing game here. And the Flyers have a game up there against them remaining, correct?
The Isles?
Or do they don't play them again?
No.
So there's no head-to-head games left. So that's a good thing, because you can't have a 4-point swing game. But of course, a win and a loss in the same night is the same effect.
Yeah.
But they worry me the most, because I don't think that Capitals team is very good.
Yeah, eventually I kind of thought they were going to have a very similar situation to Jersey, where they were just going to fall off because talent-wise it just wasn't there. But I guess you can also kind of look at the Flyers situation, where, they're not really playing with top-end talent too, and they're still hanging around. But yeah, I had anticipated the Caps to kind of fall off just a little bit more than most expected.
It's interesting, because I think they did fall off, but the problem is everyone else fell off too, and has been falling
where the
off.
Flyers could have made up ground is where they also struggled. They talked so much about that 7-game stretch against all top teams in the NHL, all playoff caliber cup winning teams, and then nobody really discussed the stretch after that they're in right now, where they really fell into this trap of, okay, we're playing these top intensity skilled teams, and we're neck and neck, and they were almost at hockey 500 during that stretch, and then they lose terribly to the Blackhawks. They lose to the Canadiens. They had those rough patches against the Isles and only got that 1 point. So I mean, it's really, it's coming down to the wire.
Yeah, it reminds me of earlier in the season when they beat Dallas, and there was that statement
and then
game,
the rest of the weekend
and they tanked for a little bit after that. It's kind of the same scenario. Like, there was so much made about this in the Dallas case, one game. In this case, the stretch of games, that everyone forgot to play after those games.
I think it was, I'm trying to remember, it was like Dallas was like a Thursday night, and then that weekend it was like Avs and Bruins, and they got shredded on home ice back to back by both of those two teams. So it was just.
But I think this is what happens when you have a young team that doesn't have experience. Because
all the flaws
a young player
out.
might say, okay, we did well against these good teams, and these other teams are not going to show up. But then when the puck gets dropped, it doesn't matter that Chicago has the worst points in the NHL. If you give them a belief, and the Flyers did, same thing with Montreal, they're going to play.
Yeah, at the end of the day, they're still professional teams. they're still the best
and even
players in the country.
Even the most lopsided of matchups in the NHL, a lot of times are 1 or 2 goal games. It's not like there's, except the San Jose Sharks.
Yeah.
But, they give up 10
Sure.
multiple times in a row. But,
that was the craziest fluke that I've ever seen in a season.
But I mean, generally, you have close games. You have games that are competitive. And I think that's where a young team gets caught up in, well, we did this against this group of teams, so we'll be fine against this group of teams. And then you're not fine because that group of teams is looking to mess up your playoff chances. And
sometimes that's all they have left at the end of the year.
For sure.
Yeah.
And I mean, that Chicago team, I was looking at the roster that night and I'm thinking, there's only a few guys I've heard of on this team. One of them's Connor Bedard, who has no experience in himself, but that's just a guy that's different.
He's going to be generational. That's a different kind of conversation.
But then you look out there and there's other guys like Seth Jones, who's played in playoff games, Tyler Johnson, who was part of Stanley Cup runs with Tampa. Those guys aren't just going to lay down.
No.
So that's where I think young guys get caught. And I think that is what John Tortorella was referring to the other night when he said some of these guys don't know how to play in games in this time of year.
Yeah.
And now
I don't think that was a call. That was just him being genuine. And then that was another point that he touched on during the thing too, is that there's transparency this year between front office and coaching and media, that, we're being open and honest. And, that's something that fans have absolutely respected and appreciated this year, because they're embracing the rebuild, but they're also being open and upfront about it. And that's so important in a situation like this. And I don't think it was really to, kind of hinder or hurt any of his players. He was just genuinely being honest with that. They have no experience late in the season where it can alter their year, where it can send them to the playoffs. It's new territory for so many of these younger guys. It's very interesting, Joe.
Yeah, he always keeps it interesting. And, when he makes comments like that about some of our guys don't know how to play here, or play at this time of year.
Yeah.
That's where I think that's what I think comes into play biggest here in this last 6 games, because those young guys, they hear him say that, and do they embrace the pressure or do they wilt under it? Because the guys in that room know who he's talking about.
Yeah.
I think we can figure out, we know who he's talking about. I mean, there's guys on the team that have playoff experience and there's guys that don't. And on this team, it's a pretty clear line. You have the guys who have experienced it, and you have the guys that don't,
have never even been anywhere touching
and weren't expecting to this year, and now they are. So they're learning on the fly, and maybe that's just what he was doing. I mean, we see there's been a lot of guys. Scott Hartnell's told me, Cam Atkinson said it in several interviews that and he did have John Tortorella when he was a younger player in Columbus. So his influence on younger players is something that gets appreciated down the line more than it does in the moment. And, maybe that's what these guys will see down the line. And maybe some of them are embracing it right now. But we're going to find out over the next 6 games for sure. And I think with this gap this week between the games and kind of the way he acted, the way he spoke after Monday's game, and then sort of adding another layer to it yesterday, I think we'll know a lot in the first 10 minutes of the game against Buffalo on Friday. And that Buffalo team, the fans are disappointed there because they don't make the playoffs for almost 2 decades straight now. So it sounds like that building, from other things I've been reading, it sounds like it's with the real diehard Sabre fans, the other fans take over the building, or it's kind of a dead building. So you might have to manufacture a little energy there, because I don't think Flyer fans are going to take over the building. It's too far away for that. And really,
who's
going
to
to
make
Buffalo.
the trek? Right, who's going to make the trek to Buffalo if you don't have to do it?
Yeah.
But we're gonna get that all covered on the Flyers Talk podcast. You can also check out our other co-host Jordan Hall's work on NBC Sports Philadelphia. We'll have it all covered there. Joe, it was great talking to you today. Great talking Flyers. And Flyers fans, thank you so much for listening, watching. Wherever you listen, please make sure to rate and subscribe. And we will talk to you guys next time.